All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum, a podcast where we talk about mostly the intersection between Christianity and ASD1. But in this episode, we aren't going to be talking about either of those things. We are going to be talking particularly about ASD3, or profound autism, and the various challenges that are associated with ASD3 and the surrounding political movements related to autism, mostly being neurodiversity and the changing discourse around autism. In previous episodes, I had mentioned a book, Chasing the Intact Mind by Amy Lutz, and I recommended that my audience take a read of it if they wanted to get more specific details on the ways in which the way we think about and talk about autism sometimes leaves people behind and has effects on the people who need the most help within the autism spectrum. And I was going to do a full book review on that, but I thought, why don't I just email Amy and see if she'll come on the podcast? And she has graciously agreed to come on the podcast. And so without further ado, Amy, why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Sure, John. Thank you so much for having me, first of all, and for your kind words about my book. I am a historian of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania with a research focus on the history and ethics of autism and intellectual disability policy and practice. And I'm also vice president and a founding board member of the National Council on Severe Autism. And I come to both my research and advocacy efforts as the mom of 5 kids, actually. But in particular, my oldest son, Jonah, who's now 26, is profoundly autistic. And shining a light on that end of the spectrum has motivated my work for the last 2 decades.
Yeah, so you've published a lot of papers, which I've been familiarizing myself with over the past month. But most significantly, you've written a book, Chasing the Intact Mind, How the Severely Autistic and Intellectually Disabled Were Excluded from the Debates That Affect Them the Most. And I was wondering, what sort of motivated you to write this book? How did that come about? And why did you decide to write this particular book?
I was really struck by this trope of the intact mind, which I define as this assumption that there is a typical or even genius intellect hidden deep inside people, even those who appear to be the most profoundly affected by autism. So I was struck by how pervasive this assumption is, and specifically how it attaches to autism and not other types of developmental disabilities. So it's very unusual to see this kind of assumption attached to people with Down syndrome or other kinds of genetic syndromes. But in autism, it's extremely pervasive. And as a historian, I was really curious about where this idea came from, because I can tell you, having a profoundly autistic son, that it doesn't reflect anything biologically true about autism. So given that this isn't biologically true, it has to come from somewhere. So I just started reading kind of psychiatric papers going back to the kind of mid 20th century, when autism is first proposed as a diagnosis by Leo Kanner in 1943. And it became clear to me that ideas around the intact mind have been pervasive since autism was first characterized as a disorder at that time. And the stickiness of this idea, how it persists through time and is still very much with us, was fascinating to me. So that was how the book came about.
Yeah, so I want to go a little bit deeper into that. What is the intact mind, and what would delineate an intact mind from a non-intact mind in just common parlance?
The opposite of the intact mind would be an impaired mind. So my son has an impaired mind, like everyone else with profound autism. In his particular case, he has a tested IQ of 40. He has some speech, but it's really functional in nature. And the kind of the impoverishment of his speech doesn't have to do with anything related to his ability to articulate his thoughts. It's more like he has no or very few abstract concepts. So he is able to speak about the things he's thinking about and the things he wants, which have to do with food or places to go or things to do or people he wants to see, but he has no idea, for example, that we live in a town that's part of a state, that's part of a country, that's part of a world, a planet, that's part of a solar system. He has no idea about the past, present, or future, or is able to participate in any kind of discourse around history or politics or religion or anything else. I really I wonder so much about what his inner mind is like. But that's an impaired mind. An intact mind would be what you and I have, a typical, or in some cases, superior intellect, able to access all of those things and eventually and self-direct and have agency in the world. But when I use the intact mind because typically when it's applied in this context to people with severe or profound autism, the assumption is the intact mind is inaccessible, at least at first. So it's there, it's been there all along, but because of the person's behavioral challenges, or there's a lot of misrepresentation about autism and it as being just a motor disorder as opposed to a cognitive or communication disorder, in which case the intact mind is inaccessible because of the motor planning problems of the person, which actually is not reflected by any data. But these are the claims that drive the intact mind assumption. People who believe in that would look at my son and say, he doesn't have an IQ of 40. It's that the tests can't measure his intelligence, or he has such profound motor issues that he can't let you know what he's thinking. And the hope would be that you'd access that intact mind through some kind of intervention, usually as some pseudoscientific intervention like facilitated communication or something like that.
Yeah. And so reading your book, it struck me that this idea of the intact mind is a really beautiful idea, right? It's this idea that there isn't actually anything wrong with a person. Their impairment doesn't exist. It's just our response. And this is, again, it's a really beautiful thought, but right. I think it just doesn't accord with the data we have. But for some people, the intact mind, I think, is accurate. And you point this out in your book. The case of cerebral palsy, there are a lot of people who we just assumed who had cerebral palsy had an impaired mind, but it wasn't actually that they had an impaired mind. They just had a motor disability that prevented them from being able to express themselves. And we see this throughout history with other disabilities, like people who are deaf or blind. Mm-hmm. And so I understand this idea, but I'm wondering if you have any insight into why it gets applied to autism, but not, for example, Down syndrome.
Yeah. So I do talk about this in the book. I think there are several reasons why autism is particularly susceptible to this kind of thinking. First of all, there are no physiological signs of autism in the sense like with Down syndrome. You look at a child with Down syndrome, you can tell because of certain features about their face and body that they have Down syndrome. So kids with autism look perfectly normal, to use that word. Just there's nothing physically wrong with them. It's easy to assume that maybe there is nothing wrong with them. But also I think that something that's really important to factor in is that autism doesn't become evident typically until a child is about 2, maybe a little younger. And so for the first, year and a half or so of the child's life, the inner representation in the parent's mind is of a typical child. There's no reason to think otherwise. Jonah was very affectionate as a small child. He's still very affectionate. He met all his gross motor milestones very early. He was first in the play group to crawl and to walk. He actually was hyperlexic as a boy and still hyperlexic, which means he had a very precocious ability to decode letters and numbers. So when he was like 15 months old, he was crawling on the pool table, putting the pool balls in number order from 1 to however many, I forget how many pool balls there are on a pool table, but we thought he was just a genius. And then he started writing in chalk on the driveway before he could talk. Of course, that when the parents think of their child in a certain way and have a whole set of hopes and dreams for that child, it becomes really hard to throw the whole operation reverse and say, actually, my child has a profound cognitive impairment, is going to require intense and round-the-clock supervision his entire life, and all the things I hoped for him, college, a meaningful career, a reciprocal romantic relationship, a family, friends, all of these things are now off the table. It's extremely hard to to change that mindset and give up on those dreams. For parents of kids with genetic syndromes like Down syndrome, or who go into it from the beginning knowing their child has severe intellectual disability, I think they just don't, they're forced to make that adjustment extremely early. So they don't have this kind of other child that's inhabiting their minds.
Yeah, that makes sense. A thing that I hear a lot from neurodiversity activists, which I know you'll push back on, is this idea that people with profound autism or ASD3, they don't actually have cognitive deficits. This is just one more different type of mind or type of brain that exists within the spectra of human experience. I think you say in your book there, neurodiversity is on its face trivially true, right? We all
Yeah.
have different brain types. But
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could explain why you think the neurodiversity framing of ASD3 doesn't work.
The kind of the rejection of severe cognitive impairment in profoundly autistic people is so puzzling to me. I can understand each individual claim, right? That it's hard to give an IQ test to somebody with profound autism. Absolutely, that's definitely true. It's more like the accumulation of evidence through various assessments and observations of the child as he grows and across, all the different contexts of their lives. So my son is 26. He still loves Sesame Street. He chooses to watch Sesame Street, Richard Scarry, Barney, all kinds of children's programming, even though he could choose to watch anything because he's hyperlexic and can read and type, he can control what he accesses on his iPad. So he can go to YouTube and find the programming he wants to watch. And this is what he wants to watch. He still sucks his thumb, and it's just the kind of the behavior and the things he talks about and the things he chooses across all the different dimensions of his life present someone with a very significant intellectual disability. There's nothing age appropriate or even that reflects the preferences of someone with typical cognition. There's nobody with typical cognition at the age of 26 who would choose to spend most of their day watching Sesame Street. There are other things that person would choose to do. So I think and again, this isn't an assessment that comes from just one factor about Jonah, but it comes from 26 years of assessments of not just his intelligence, his academic performance, his functional skills, his ability to take care of himself, his activities of daily living, etc. All of this converges on a profile that represents someone with a significant cognitive impairment. So we need to meet Jonah where he is and help him build the skills that will enable him to have the most independent life possible, knowing that is never going to be truly independent. Jonah will never be able to even walk out the front door and go for a walk by himself because he has limited safety awareness. And even though we've been working as part of his goals at school, well, it's now he's in an adult program, but it's where he went to school. So we still call it school in our house, to get him to stop at a curb. Like, these are the types of goals he has. So he doesn't get hit by a car. That's a really hard thing to teach. So we probably will be working on this for the foreseeable future. So we need to meet him where he is and not pretend he's something that he's not.
Yeah. And one thing that I've pointed out before, and I mean, I use this as a joking metaphor because it sounds absurd, is you could look at a broken leg and you could say, you don't have a broken leg.
Yeah.
You have a bone diverse leg. And that is technically true, right? You could look at it like that. But at the same time, that isn't very helpful for someone who has a broken leg. That doesn't do anything for them. Let's reframe how we think about this. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how you reframe how you think about it, because there are profound logistical and practical implications to all these things that you need to take care of. And one of the things that I feel I'm constantly explaining is that it's fine to just acknowledge that sometimes things aren't working the way that you want them to, or that some people just have profound disabilities, and that's okay. Right? There's nothing wrong with saying that, and it's not. Sometimes people get really antsy about talking about autism in terms of capacities, or just like labeling capacities or deficits or lack thereof. But I think that it's not really ableist to just say what's happening.
I actually think it's ableist to pretend disability away. I know you said you've had Freddie DeBoer on your podcast. We have little mutual admiration society going on, and I think that his piece on the gentrification of disability was probably one of the first things I read by him, and I thought that was so smart, and I couldn't agree more that we're living in this era of, other people have called it toxic positivity, where you're not allowed to say that being profoundly autistic is bad. It's worse than being non-autistic or even being level 1 autistic, that there are lots of material harms that profoundly autistic people experience. And what it comes down to me is a very simple question, like, would you ever choose profound autism for yourself or for your child? And no person who has ever spent 30 seconds with anybody who's profoundly autistic has any knowledge about what that's would ever make that choice. So I think it's safe to say that profound autism is, yeah, I'll say it, it's a tragedy. And the kind of suffering that profoundly autistic individuals experience, the care burden on their families, how constrained and restricted those lives are, that is not something that we would ever want to choose. And it's okay to say that. In fact, we have to say that and validate that experience.
Yeah, and I that's something I actually also emphasize with ASD1. And I know ASD1 is not even close to the same level, doesn't present even close to the same level of difficulties, but I found a lot of people with ASD1 have a lot of difficulty expressing that they're not having a good time and they don't wish they were like this. And one of the things I'm constantly saying is it's okay to just say this sucks and you don't want this to happen, but at the same time you have to acknowledge that it is happening and that you can't really get away from it and you actually have to deal with it. And yeah, like I've never quite understood the concern that labeling it as profound or severe or something that is worse than not being there. I've never quite understood that. I see it a lot in books as of like 2015-ish is when I really started to see it, particularly with claims about ASD3, that there's no such thing as a difference between ASD 1, 2, or 3. I'm wondering, have you come across that? Do you know where that comes from? Because I'm not sure where the genesis of that is or why it even is a thing.
Yeah, kind of neurodiversity activists have been pushing back against functioning labels for a long time. So before there was the term profound autism, which has really emerged in the last couple of years as the first way of splitting up the spectrum, again, following the kind of lumping move of DSM-5, which got rid of Asperger's and PDD-NOS and the kind of different subtypes of autism and made everybody ASD at different levels. So now we have a move to split the spectrum up again with profound autism, which we can talk about later. But even before the profound autism was a thing, a lot of neurodiversity activists were embracing this universal view of autism where functioning is fluid. That's a lot of the objection to functioning labels. I think people who were diagnosed as or considered high functioning, you're not allowed to use that term anymore, although I do use high and low functioning.
It's a practical term. It means things, and you can immediately like communicate so much about what you mean when you just say that.
And
I don't really
the
care if people use
alternatives
it.
that have been proposed by neurodiversity advocates, for example, high and low support needs, are not only are they euphemisms, but they're not accurate, because Stephen Hawking had high support needs, but he was still a freaking genius who could direct his own care and make a huge contribution to science while he was at it. Jonah he has high support needs, but he is not a genius. And so until someone comes up with an alternative to high and low functioning that encapsulates that level of intellectual disability that is the kind of one of the real problems in as far as one of the real constraints on a low functioning person's agency and ability to move around the world, then I'm going to use high and low functioning.
Yeah, I always basically just use them as a synonym for, are you intellectually disabled and autistic, or are you not intellectually disabled and autistic? But I think a lot of people hear high functioning and they're like, I'm not intellectually disabled, but I have difficulty functioning. And it's like, true, don't doubt you. I'm in the same boat.
Yeah.
I would not be doing very well if it wasn't for my wife who helps me with a lot of things. But also I have a wife. Like I was able to go through the courtship process. I was able to convince someone to marry me. I'm able to have a job. I'm able to be employed, even though I do struggle with functioning. I don't have an intellectual disability. And so when I compare myself to someone who does, it's okay, obviously there is a delineation here, and the delineation is basically intellectually disabled or not intellectually disabled.
Yeah, and
And
just to be clear, I don't parents like myself who are end up in the autism wars against the neurodiversity activists, none I know I certainly would never say, and I don't think any of my friends or allies would ever say that people with level 1 autism have no issues. That is not the case that we are making. And the case is that your issues are very different, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively from the issues that our kids are facing. And while we would never presume to tell you, I would never presume to tell you, John, about the supports you need to thrive in your work environment, in your marriage, in your family life, because I literally have no idea. I would also ask the same consideration, which is please don't tell me about what my son, who is very different than you, what he needs to live his best life. And I feel like if we could just have this mutual kind of
yep.
consideration and humility about the opposite end of the spectrum, then we would not have to be at war all the time.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, and I have long been advocating that just if you have ASD1, talk about ASD1 and
Yeah.
people with ASD1. And yeah, the you do get some parents of autistic children who are like Asperger's isn't a real thing, ASD1 isn't a real
Yeah.
thing. They tend to be on the sort of alternative biomedical side, in my
Yeah.
experience. I have, since starting this podcast, I get quite a few emails of angry parents telling me I don't actually have autism.
Yeah.
I okay. I don't know. I find it hard to get upset with them because they're having a rough time. I get it. This is not an easy thing. Whatever. I will let you say whatever you want to me and not really take it too personally, because I'm sure if we were meeting under different circumstances, this would be fine. But yeah, I think what you said is really important there, that it's understand that just because you have the label autism doesn't give you a magical understanding stick that allows you to fully understand all autistic experiences.
Yeah.
And yeah, like there are stupid things that happen from both sides, but even though there are stupid things that happen from both sides, I think that some of those things are more harmful and impactful than others. And that's like the second half of your book, which is 3 case studies on the effects that this assumption of the intact mind has on people with profound autism. And so I just want to talk about those case studies because I think they did a really good job of just illustrating the tangible, measurable, and like empirically verifiable evidence that this doesn't always lead to good outcomes,
Yeah.
and that sort of assuming an intact mind and assuming competence in all these places can actually have like profoundly negative influences on people. So I think I want to just start by asking you. So there are 3 case studies in the book. One is 14C protections, one is guardianship, and one is facilitated communication. I was wondering, why did you choose those 3 examples? Because if I was writing this book, I would have chosen different examples, but still great examples. But why did you choose these ones?
I'm curious to hear the ones that you would choose.
Oh, I would have
So,
chosen research
yeah,
because
okay.
that's the place I'm in. I just have a lot of bones to pick with the way that like you have studies coming out saying autistic people don't struggle with communication. It's like, what
Yeah,
are you
yeah,
talking about, man? Yeah, so that would have been my big thing, and like the sort of semantic drift of what is and isn't autism makes it very confusing for people who have undiagnosed autism and are trying to figure out what it is and what it isn't and things like that.
yeah.
But that's mostly because those are issues that affect people with ASD1 mostly, which is why I think I would have just chosen those differently, because I don't have anyone in my family with ASD3. I know a lot of families of people with ASD3, but it's not something that viscerally impacts my life like you. So why did you choose these 3 particular case studies?
There were a couple of reasons. First of all, I came to this project like maybe noticing the intact mind assumption in our current kind of policy and disability service landscape and asking where this came from. So I hope none of my Penn colleagues are listening because it's taboo to be a historian who's really focused on the present. But that's how I come to this. And I picked those particular case studies. First of all, some of the issues that I also could have chosen that I've written a lot about, I just didn't want to write any more about. So residential settings for adults with autism is something else that would have been a good case study, because where I live in Pennsylvania, you're not allowed to build any housing larger than four disabled people, because neurodiversity activists have successfully changed the definition of institution from something like Willowbrook that had 6,000 people to anything larger than four, which is really insane. But I've written a lot about that already. So I wanted to do something I hadn't tackled before. And first of all, I chose the 14C, the sub-minimum wage. That was probably the first thing I chose, mostly because I thought that in that example, the debates around 14C are amongst the most deranged, and in the sense that the rhetoric that's deployed by anti-14C activists is false and very detached from the reality of 14C on the ground. And we're in the situation where they're being very successful. 14C has been eliminated in 16 states, I believe. And at the end of his administration, President Biden's Department of Labor issued a proposed rule eliminating it at the federal level. And the only reason that rule is not going to be finalized is because of the timetable. The Department of Labor was not able to get it done before the Trump administration took over. And this isn't going to be a priority of the Trump administration at all. So I'm guessing that 14C participants are safe for now. But what I meant was just like if you get involved in that debate, the kind of crazy things that you hear anti-14C activists say, most of whom have never worked in a 14C program, are just offended at the sheer existence of these programs, and they circulate a lot of false information about it, versus if you talk to the participants who are able to comment on why they like or don't like their kind of 14C program, and especially the families, you hear a completely different story. Plus, the 14C fight is clearly predicated on the assumption that all of these people in 14C programs could be working competitive minimum wage jobs. We just got rid of the 14C programs. In this telling, 14C is the obstacle to competitive integrated employment, not the alternative for those whose severe cognitive impairments preclude this kind of work. That's clearly all of these things clearly have at their core this intact mind assumption, even if it's not necessarily explicitly articulated in the debates. Guardianship, I just thought, again, like you said, it's truly amazing, mostly because I had that one in my mind because a few years ago, a friend of mine and I described this in the book, went to a World Autism Day event held by the United Nations in New York. And she texted me afterwards and she was like, "You would not believe it. The chair of the United Nations kind of one of their disability committees compared guardianship to genital mutilation." And I thought my friend was being hyperbolic. Surely this can't be true. But so I actually tracked down the video on the site to go watch it for myself. And yes, it's exactly what she said. This is such a gross violation of human rights that guardianship for people who do not have the capacity to make decisions for themselves is comparable to genital mutilation. That's how unhinged the rhetoric is. And to have the United Nations at the forefront of this call to just eliminate guardianship as a form of substitute decision making, like this is scary and just so fantastical. It's the idea that just asserting capacity and just insisting upon it in all contexts. The United Nations and the Convention on the Rights for People with Disabilities has said that everybody, including people with intellectual disabilities, should be able to have mortgages and sign contracts and do things that would be very dangerous if there were no protections in place to prevent that kind of thing from happening. And as far as the facilitated communication thing, that was just so far off the rails and has just gotten more off the rails since then. I'm not sure if you in Canada
Yeah.
are following like the telepathy tapes
Oh, so since
podcast.
the telepathy tapes came out, I
Yeah,
have had 6 or 7 emails asking me to comment on it.
yeah,
And every single time I respond with facilitated communication
yeah,
is not empirically verified to have any
yeah.
efficacy, and that spelling to communicate is while it often appears as though something is going on, appearances are very deceiving, and in controlled scientific experiments, these things have never been replicated. Anyway.
And that is something one of my first things that I wrote for the kind of the platform Slate was about, at least partially about facilitated communication back probably early 2000s or 2010 or something. And one of the things I never had on my radar was facilitated communication roaring back in the way it has. And it's so heartbreaking. I understand, believe me, I understand the hope that drives parents, the absolute desire to access that intact mind that we all hope is in there. Because when it comes right down to it, nothing else matters in the world. All of the things that philosophers call the good life, all of these things hinge on an intact mind. As I discussed earlier, all the things that Jonah will not be able to do. And every parent just wants those things for their kid. And thinking about a whole lifetime of either providing that care or entrusting paid caregivers to provide very intense care to people who can't self-report abuse or neglect. We're seeing how that goes wrong all the time. It's scary and it's hopeless. And so I understand the kind of hope that drives parents to try different forms of facilitated communication. But what I don't understand is the failure to test and to say, how do I need to make sure this is really my child talking? And it's very easy to do because all you have to do to test whether who is controlling the output in any form of facilitated communication is to ask the speller to communicate something that is definitely unknown to the facilitator. And you're right that in 3 decades, authentic communication has never been demonstrated under controlled conditions using spelling, using any kind of spelling method, even though the James Randi Foundation offered $1 million to anybody who could do it. And the overwhelming scientific evidence against that, just, I don't understand why parents are not more cautious.
Yeah, I like with a lot of alternative medicines things, I understand why the parents get
Yeah,
involved in this. I truly get it. It is a desperate situation and you're grasping for straws, and these straws tell you that we've got a cure.
yeah,
Or I completely understand the psychology behind that. I don't understand the psychology behind the practitioners who, like the non-autistic practitioners who, or the people who don't have autistic family members who are involved in this and true believers. That I can't understand very well.
one thing I just want to distinguish between FC and other types of alternative interventions. Look, every profound autism family goes down that alternative
Oh
therapy
yeah,
route,
I
like
and I
when our
get it.
kids were little. So we've all tried the gluten and casein-free diet, B12 injections. We did brushing. We did hyperbaric oxygen treatment. There's always this feeling like I had this feeling a lot during the 40 hours I spent in the hyperbaric oxygen chamber. I was like, this is ridiculous. I could be breathing in just room air as far as I know. How do I even know this is real? And like, why on earth would this help Jonah's very severe behavioral and cognitive challenges? You hear some kind of anecdotal report that it made a big difference. And what if that was the thing and you didn't do it because you didn't want to spend the money or waste the time or whatever? But those things don't have they're not harmful, right? There's no one had serious harm from B12 injections or from being on a gluten and casein free diet for a year or so, or 10 years or whatever. But there's such a profound harm to facilitated communication because there are lots of harms, which I go into in the book, but most fundamentally, and the one that parents should be the most concerned about, is hijacking the agency of people who have very little agency to start off with. Jonah has very little control over his world. He doesn't get to choose the day program he goes to, like where he lives. He's stuck with us at home, whether he likes it or not. And when that day comes, when he will move out because he can't live at home forever, he won't choose. That'll be something we have to choose as parents or siblings if something happens to us. But he does have some control. He can say that he wants ketchup and hamburger and french fries for dinner. He wants to watch Sesame Street. He wants to see my sister, his absolute favorite person, Aunt Carrie. He can ask for that. But when you say that what the person spells on the letterboard trumps the actual communication of the speller, because a lot of these spellers do have some spoken language like Jonah does, or can type things on independently on a computer to like search for videos and so forth. But one of the central tenets of any form of facilitated communication is that what is spelled supersedes what is said or communicated through behavior. So even if the speller keeps trying to get up and push the letterboard away, but then when you manage to sit down and hold that letterboard in front of them, they spell, "I'm sorry, I'm not controlling my body. I do want to write this poem with you or read this New York Times article with you," or whatever it is. That takes precedence. So that leaves the very disabled people with the zero agency in the world. And that is scary. And that is what I want parents to protect. That is what we, as the parents of profoundly dependent people, we need to protect and maximize their agency. So even if you're tempted to try forms of facilitated communication, you need to build in those checks to make sure that you're not speaking over or replacing the voice of someone who has very little control over their environment.
There's a fairly disturbing documentary on Netflix called Tell Them You Love Me about
Yeah, I saw.
facilitated communication, which, if anyone's curious, yeah, it's one of the sort of high profile cases of
Yeah,
abuse in facilitated communication and how dangerous that exact mechanism is that you just described. And yeah, the people who aren't aware of autism and who
yeah,
don't understand it see it and think, oh, this is so nice. Because, like
yeah,
we talked about before, the assumption of an intact mind is this beautiful idea. And finally, this genius intellect is being expressed. But oftentimes, it is less a genius intellect and more a ambitious person accidentally puppeting the person.
yeah,
Even if they truly believe it, the subconscious is a very powerful tool that can be used. But I want to just circle back to 14C and then guardianship, because I think these are just profoundly impactful things that I think people on my side need to be aware about and the
mhm,
effects they have. 14C and the fight against 14C isn't something that's behind the curtains or anything like that. This is like a formal part of ASAN's platform, so the
yeah,
Autistic Self Advocacy Network. If you go to their, just look on their website for 14C, they are like, we need to abolish 14C. It's really interesting in the article that they have about why we need to abolish 14C. They talk about cost of living, and they
yeah,
talk about like how much apartments and food costs and things like that.
yeah.
And I find that confusing, mostly because, do you know people who work in 14C organizations? They're not sole providers for
Right.
themselves. So I was wondering if you can just describe what that's like. What are 14C?
So 14C, yeah. So the kind of the old term for 14C programs is sheltered workshops. And try to avoid using that term because the families that I know whose loved ones are in 14C programs right now really don't like that terminology because it has so many negative connotations. So I just try to use the regulatory number, which is 14C, was started by the Department of Labor in 1938, and it was meant to support people with physical disabilities, mostly people who are blind, and veterans coming back from eventually from World War II. But now, today, virtually everybody who's in a 14C program has a significant to severe intellectual disability or intractable psychiatric condition that, like schizophrenia, that precludes competitive employment. There's only 44,000 people in 14C programs now because of multiple reasons. Advocates have been very successful in shutting it down in a lot of states, but also there's been a real investment in supported employment, which is really good for the people who want that choice and are able to do that work. So it's definitely true that historically people with milder disabilities may have been forced into 14C programs simply because of a lack of supported employment options, and that's definitely not okay. I have not heard that story recently, mostly because it's a hard fight to get somebody in a 14C program now, never mind forcing them into one. But anyway, disability rights advocates have never liked 14C ever since, even since it was first introduced. So the two main arguments against 14C today that you'd hear if you went to any, to ASON's platform or listen to the listening sessions that, as I did when the Department of Labor held them regarding this proposed rulemaking like a year or two ago. One is that this is financial exploitation of disabled people. And basically, the image that's painted is of a Monty Burns. I don't know this is if this is a reference you get from The Simpsons, if you get that in Canada, but like this old crone, this old capitalist, just like getting rich off the backs of disabled people, which is absolutely not the reality of 14C. So most 14C providers are actually nonprofit vocational rehab agencies, and nobody is expected to live off the wages that they get in a 14C program. To your point earlier, this is when you say, do you know anyone in a 14C program? Usually the people in 14C are significantly to severely disabled, and they receive extensive budgets from the state that might go well into the six figures. And if you include residential care, the cost of the 14C program, it costs money to provide that level of kind of support and supervision during the days. Also transportation, maybe different types of therapies or respite to families or whatever. So these participants have budgets, as I said, into the six figures. So how are we to say that because their wages from the 14C program might be only like $3 an hour and very low, that this is exploiting them when they're getting all their other needs met through just by calling it something different? And also, by the way, rolled into those budgets would be something like SSI. And if you increase the wages of a disabled person, then that's just going to be taken out the other end from their SSI. So there is no financial exploitation here. Nobody is doing this because they need to live on this money. The wages are a tiny fraction of the overall support they get from the state. And that's virtually always lost in these debates.
Yeah, and 14C work typically they're not, like you said, they're not assembling iPhones in a factory, right? A lot of them are like washing tables, or they'll have a job mentor or someone like that who will be supervising them as they do various tasks in different places. A lot of them do shredding and recycling, and just tasks that they are able to do that give them a sense of purpose, a sense of fulfillment, and also they get to hang out with other people like them. And again, the people aren't really cracking the whip in these places. I know lots of people who work in these places. While I don't know that, I know their families of people who work in these places, and sometimes they're working, sometimes they're watching a puppet show, sometimes they're chatting to their friends, sometimes they're hanging out. And a lot of them, I think you pointed out in the book, in this case study, that could some of them be Walmart greeters? Yes, but a lot of them don't want to be Walmart greeters because the other people at Walmart don't want to discuss Sesame Street with them. And the people at the other 14C places do want to discuss Sesame Street with them. And like a lot of these places, like they're not, like you said, this isn't Monty Burns. They're not building iPhones. They often have to fundraise outside. Like the work that they do doesn't produce enough money, and so they have to do fundraising drives and things like that. And a lot of people, like the assumption that a lot of people on the neurodiversity activism side of things think is that once we eliminate 14C, everyone's getting minimum wage. Everyone's getting a full-time minimum wage job. They're going straight from 14C employment to a good paying job. And I think there have been like a few examples where that's happened, where a person has gone from 14C to like full-time, high-paying, gainful employment. In your book, you talk about a blind lawyer who went from that, but that's one out of how many? Because what happens to the majority of these people once 14C places get shut down?
You would think there would be a lot of data about that, because I believe Vermont closed its 14C programs 20 years ago. So there should be a lot of longitudinal data to track former participants once their 14C option is taken away. The data is really sparse. And as one of my interlocutors from Minnesota, one of my 14C providers told me, and I quote in the book, it's as if they don't really want to know. But what the data that is available show is that there is no massive migration into competitive employment post elimination of 14C. Some participants are able to get competitive integrated employment, but in most cases, it's for far fewer hours per week than they were able to work in their 14C program. For example, it's possible that Jonah could stock the cooler at someplace like Walmart, or Wawa is our convenience store, as long as he had a full-time, like a job coach with him the entire time. But his service budget, is not going to pay for 40 hours of that. And Jonah's not in a 14C program, I'm just using him as his example. But maybe instead of 30 hours, what a former 14C participant might have had before, now they have 4 hours a week with a job coach at a place like stocking the cooler at a convenience store or something. Instead of having a lot more structure and activity during the day, now they have 4 hours a week, but that's considered to be a victory because now they're in competitive integrated employment. The fact is, most participants either former participants end up being shuttled into what's known as just day programs, which a lot of the parents I talked to just dismissed as glorified babysitting, where they're not working, but they're not doing anything. Maybe they're doing some arts and crafts, or there's a TV on, or whatever it is. They just end up stuck at home, and families have to make sure that they have caregiver at home all the time, which requires at least one parent to quit their job or somehow private pay to have caregivers on site.
Yeah, and like from the people I know, and this is anecdotal, they quite enjoy their job. And
That's the
they
thing. The other big objection that's raised about 14C programs, besides the financial exploitation thing, as we talked about, is that these are segregated. And this is bad because we don't want to warehouse disabled people. And you find this argument, it attaches to a lot of different debates, including the residential one. This is why neurodiversity activists push for these small, dispersed settings versus larger intentional communities, like we have for seniors, for example. My mom, until she died, lived in a gated community that was just for seniors, and there was no problem with that. But for some reason, if we do that for intellectually disabled people, that's segregation. And something that I just find so deeply offensive about this debate, and shocking considering this argument is raised by people who allegedly have disabilities themselves, is that a bunch of disabled people is bad. It's segregated. It's institutional. And the best thing we can do for anybody with any form of intellectual or developmental disability is to surround them with as many neurotypical people as possible. And you know what? Those autistic or intellectually disabled people who can articulate a preference, a lot of them, you're right, like their 14C programs because they like to be surrounded by peers. And probably my favorite quote from the whole book, what comes from that chapter on 14C, where the mom of one of the 14C participants was like, no, my daughter does not want to be the one disabled greeter at Walmart surrounded by a bunch of non-disabled people. What's so hard to understand about that? And I think it makes complete sense. But for some reason, the idea of disabled community, of autistic and otherwise intellectually disabled people together and enjoying each other's company, is completely dismissed as segregation.
and I think that's a great point. And I think the final thing that gets brought up a lot, at least the one that I hear a lot, is about like the history of abuses.
Yeah.
And there absolutely have been, right? Like
Sure.
there is no place with vulnerable populations that hasn't had an abuse scandal. So daycares, senior centers, care homes, all these places have all had abuse scandals. But the solution isn't to shut down daycare across the country. It's to reform these things and put checks and balances in place and make sure workers have vulnerable persons checks and people are educated and that there's oversight. Like that's the solution. The solution isn't in the past. These have been used very poorly. And you point out some examples of that in your book, but I just think those aren't particularly persuasive arguments because well, just because in the past things were done poorly, the response isn't burn it down, the response is make it better, especially if it's providing a useful service to people, especially if it is good and helping people and people want it, especially this really vulnerable population.
You're right. The historical argument is just thrown about in all of these debates, whether it's guardianship. There have been definitely abuse under guardianship before. In 14C, it was Henry's Turkey Farm, people being shuttled into 14C programs who could have had competitive integrated employment if with even a minimum of supports, or large residential settings. Willowbrook and Penhurst is huge anchors in that debate. But you're right. The fact is that abuse and neglect happen to profoundly autistic people across the entire range of settings, from the family home to small group homes to larger settings. It's a very vulnerable population, and we do need a lot of supervision and accountability. No one is saying that we don't, but you're right. That doesn't mean we get rid of different models that provide much needed support for people.
And another important thing I think you mentioned is that we shouldn't force people into
Yeah,
14C, right?
yeah,
Like that
yeah,
isn't the argument that's being made. It's
right.
14C if you want it,
Yeah,
right? Or
exactly.
14C if that's what you prefer. Not you need to be locked in
Yeah,
14C, but it is one of the many options that are available for you to take if it is something that is appropriate or something that you want, and have exit plans. I think in some 14C provisions, there's a checkup every 6 months to see if you should be, or if you're available for other type of competitive minimum wage employment. I don't know if that's across every
yeah.
state.
Yeah, no, it's a federal requirement from the
Okay, cool,
Workforce
yeah.
Innovation and Opportunity Act, requires that 14C participants be presented every year with the opportunity to pursue competitive employment if they would like to. And virtually none of them choose that option. So 14C is actually very highly controlled as far as the wages that are paid, like how those wages are determined, who can provide that service. And that's another thing that's lost from the debate. Is this is not, you can't just decide to start a business and pay your disabled employees 30 cents an hour and kind of game the system. It just doesn't work like that.
Yeah. And I just think all this nuance is completely out when 14C is talked about from my
Yeah.
side. And so I
Yeah.
thought this was just
It's
like a
there.
really good case
Yeah.
study that like properly articulates, look, this, your idea of what 14C is and the reality of 14C, like the Venn diagram overlap is very slight, if any.
And
And
basically, you have a situation where people who would never qualify or be recommended for a 14C program are fighting to eliminate them because they are just personally offended at the fact that they exist, even though these are not for them. And I've just never understood this logic, which is I don't want X, so nobody should have it.
I often say it's worrying about hypothetical risk to a hypothetical version of yourself that doesn't
Yeah.
exist, which makes sense if, like, the way that I understand it and the way that I understand what they're doing is, there's a, if I was born in a different environment, I imagine there are other people like me who were born in different environments who would be exploited by this. And it's sort of like, well, okay, but no. Like you run the thought experiment incorrectly. Like, you in a different environment would still be you, and like you still have, you don't have an intellectual disability,
Yeah.
right? Like you still have the ability to reason through these things. And yes, if you were raised, if your family didn't have the access to the resources it has, you would have a worse life. This is trivially true for most people, right?
Yeah.
Across the board. And I just don't find these arguments particularly compelling, and I find them divorced from reality. But
Yeah.
even more divorced from reality, I think, is the guardianship debate.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth going into that, because that's a sort of fun fact I like to drop on people. Do you know ASAN opposes guardianship? Yeah. And I think it's important to say they're not like completely get rid of guardianship, but they're get rid of guardianship and replace it with this other system, which is, oh, I'm forgetting the acronym for it.
Supported decision making.
Supported decision making. Yes.
Yeah.
Could you explain what that is?
Sure. Supported decision making is how you make decisions or I make decisions. So if you ask your wife, I have this opportunity to go for a new position at work, should I do it? Or I think we should move to a different house or whatever, and you talk it out. That's supported decision making, where the kind of the person at the center, the disabled person, chooses advisors in an informal way to advise them in a non-binding capacity on how to make important decisions. And again, it's just very closely resembles the way kind of typical people make decisions all the time by consulting with their friends and family members. And completely lost from the push for supported decision making is that the reason why guardianship is a necessary protection for people with some types of cognitive impairments is that they lack the judgment to choose the appropriate advisors and make the best decision that maximizes their long-term interests. That's why they need guardianship in the first place. There's no type of advice I could give Jonah to enable him to make important decisions about his health care or where he's going to live or what he's going to do, like what kind of day program he's going to have. His intellectual disability precludes that. And there's lots of people who have that level of intellectual disability, not just people with profound autism, but adult seniors with dementia or people with traumatic brain injuries. And these individuals need to be protected so that they're not taken advantage of, so that there's someone who's looking out for their best interests. The problem with supported decision making is there's no accountability built in. So if somebody takes advantage of the autistic person, there's no court oversight or anything like that. You're just out of luck.
Yeah, and I think like people don't quite realize how divorced from reality a lot of the guardianship debate gets. There is often a push from the self-advocate side that everyone can advocate for themselves and everyone can express their preferences. And that might be true in some sense, maybe, but like whether or not those are good decisions, like you said, whether or not the judgment, like you could make the decision to eat nothing but candy for every single meal, and I'm sure many people would, but this is not good a judgment to make. I think that's something that's completely lost from the debate. And there's this part in this chapter where I forget what the test is called, but I think it was one of the mothers who recommended a test called like the 1 hour autism test, where you sit down and you just talk to an autistic person with profound autism for a full hour and just do that and then see if after that hour you think that they're capable of making these types of decisions. And I've done that. Like I've done a lot of that. I've spent a lot of time with them, and I think that's one of the reasons that made me initially start to really question a lot of the neurodiversity activism stuff, was looking at this and being like, but something else is going on here.
Yeah, I would like to believe, and I hope, I do believe, I have always believed, I should say, that part of this insane rhetoric about nobody needs guardianship or everybody can work their own competitive minimum wage job or live in their own house is just emerges from this lack of experience or exposure to what profound autism looks like. Because I do believe if you've never seen a profoundly autistic person or spent any time with them, it is really hard to imagine what it's like caring for someone who is a threat to hurt themselves or others, who might hit themselves in the face hundreds of times an hour for reasons that we are unable to determine, who will elope or just as soon as your back is turned, make a mad dash out the door without any kind of regard for whether there's cars in the road or into a pool, even if they can't swim. Like, it's just impossible to imagine this type of behavior, this kind of existential threat that a lot of families have, that people with profound autism or kids with profound autism, they're constantly at a threat to hurt themselves. And it's like imagining a color you haven't seen. So as much as parents try to describe that life, I think it bounces off a lot of people. And it isn't until you spend some time with these families that you understand the level of impairment, the kind of crazy logistical support that is required to keep that person safe and happy. So it makes me feel really good that you've put that time in, because I think that if more people did that, maybe these autism wars would wind down, because
I think they would.
That. Yeah.
So one of the things, so I know a lot of people with ASD1 who either have ASD3 children or are full-time caregivers of people with ASD3 or work in care homes for people who have ASD2 and 3 and other sorts of intellectual disabilities. And all of them are very much not on the side of I'll say the extreme wing of the neurodiversity activist movement, because it's very hard to deny what's right in front of your eyes, right? If you see it day in and day out, it's at a certain point we need to call a spade and just acknowledge that some people just have profound limitations and capacity limitations, and that's okay. And it's fine that people do, but we can't pretend that isn't the case.
Well,
you
here's
mentioned,
my hot take. You
yeah,
can tell me if you disagree, but
yeah,
I've
sure.
I've come to believe that actually most level one autistics are that most are on the side of the parents. Like there most people are like you, right? Who say what I have is not what Jonah has. It's so obvious. And I think that the reason why neurodiversity activists have had such a stranglehold on the discourse is that these level one autistics who are just out there living their lives, like if they speak up and challenge that neurodiversity rhetoric, they get like labeled as self-hating autistics or
Yes, I got that a lot.
that that they find to be traumatic and unnecessary. So they just sit this one out, like they're just out living their lives. Yeah.
So I actually have quite a bit of data on that.
Oh
Uh,
yeah. What
I
do you
do
found?
lots of interviews and lots
Yeah.
of surveys of autistic people, and one of the things that I've found, there is one group that's an exception, which is typically very left wing, very progressive autistics. If you're not in that category, typically I will say, ask like, do you have autism?
Yeah.
As a very simple question, just because it evokes different responses from people, and many of them will say, yeah, but it's ASD1,
Yeah.
or yeah, but I'm high functioning, or yeah,
Yeah.
but it's like Asperger's,
Right.
where the majority of us who aren't in activist movements, if they are in activist movements, they'll just say yes, and I'm proud to be autistic, and I love calling myself autistic. But for a lot of us, there's a sort of like uneasiness with which we are grouped with people who have ASD3. And a lot of this gets imputed on us as ableism, that we're
Yeah.
ashamed to be associated with people like your son. And that's not at all the case. I'm not ashamed to be lumped into the same diagnostic category as people like your son. I just realized that it's very different, right? Like it is materially different. And the struggles and hardships that your son and your family are going through are not even remotely similar to the ones that I'm going through and the
Mhm.
ones that my family's going through. And it feels weird to pretend like it's not, right? It just feels odd and awkward to I was in the military for 10 years, and like I often jokingly refer to it as stolen valor, that it feels like I'm claiming a hardship that I don't have, because I know all these people who actually have these profound hardships. But yeah, so I would say probably like 70 to 75% reflexively
Yeah.
differentiate and reflexively say, yeah, but I don't have ASD1. And I think a big problem though is a lot of them simply don't know people with ASD3 and don't have a lot of contact with people with ASD3. And when you
Yeah.
get diagnosed with autism, if you're like me, you get diagnosed, what's the very first thing you do? You go on the internet, you Google autism. What
Right.
does it mean? And what resources are you given? You are given ASAN, you are given neurodiversity stuff. And so your perception of how you're now supposed to think about this thing that you just learned that you have is shaped by this rhetoric of disability. And it usually takes us a while to stop and think, okay, you go through this intense learning phase, and then you need to step back and go, okay, let's critically examine this, or let's think about this for a while. The only group of people that I have not seen that happen to are people with ASD1 who have siblings with ASD3, or cousins with ASD3, or
Yeah.
like family or some form of close connection to someone with ASD3. They don't go through that phase. They start off with that.
For you. So do you have a database of people who are like ASD1 but have siblings that are ASD3?
I don't have a huge number of them. I do have quite a few, though, probably like in the 30s and 40s
Because that
of
is
numbers.
something that with my colleagues from Drexel, were in the very initial stages of working, and this is not really for your podcast, maybe cut this out, but since you brought it up, of really interrogating that population of ASD1 adults with ASD3 siblings and comparing their feelings about neurodiversity and other issues related with kind of neurotypical siblings of ASD3 individuals. And our expectation is that there's going to be virtually no difference, that these ASD1 siblings are not going to be like pro neurodiversity or think they know better than their parents what their ASD3 sibling needs or wants because of that exposure. So I'm just curious if that's
So,
something that,
so what I've found from this is that it is different. It's
yeah.
not meaningfully different. So, what I mean by that is people with ASD1 will look at their ASD3 siblings and they'll say, I can recognize parts of myself in my ASD3 sibling. Like when he's having a meltdown, I know what that means. I have a more visceral experience of that, and I can see a sort of shadow or parallel. They're still not like they're still not like on the pro neurodiversity movement, or they'll be neurodiversity for me but not for my brother. This is a useful movement for me, and this is a useful movement to conceptualize myself, but this is not this does nothing for him.
Yeah.
So it's close to that, but the only difference that I've noticed is that people with ASD1 are like better able to recognize like their own internal feelings having some parallels to their siblings.
Yeah.
And I think that slightly changes things, but not a whole lot. But yeah, this is generally what I found. Yeah, so the issue I wanted to bring up with you, which is one that I hammer on all the time, is autism research and the way that autism research affects people on the autism spectrum. It has been a wild ride since I've been doing this sort of intensively since 2014. And the way that autism was when I first started is we would just say, oh yeah, we have mentalizing deficits, we have theory of mind deficits, and no one cared at
Yeah.
all. However, now there have been a lot of movements to control and police language and change the way that we talk about autism so that we can't say anything negative about autism.
Yeah.
And so I sent you this article, which I've talked about before on the podcast. And before on the podcast, I said, imagine if you were a parent of a child with ASD3 and you read this article, what would you think?
Uh,
And now we have an opportunity to not just play that hypothetical thought experiment, but I sent you this article, and the article in it says, it's a press release for a study, and the press release says, autistic people communicate just as effectively as others, study says. And so what do you think about that and that way of talking about autism?
There's a lot of conversation in the autism community about how profoundly autistic people are excluded from research. That's been well documented because it's really hard to put someone like Jonah in a scanner. He can't answer any questions, like he can't participate in this type of research where he has to have to follow directions and on all of that. So this research focuses exclusively on extremely high functioning people, including, it sounds like from their description, some self-diagnosed people. So this really tells us nothing about, but yet it doesn't stop them from generalizing about autistic people and their kind of social communication. Now, one of the things that really puzzles me about studies like this is that this is from neurodiversity researchers. I recognize some of their names. And so this is a group that will die on the hill of the social model of disability, which I feel like you mentioned. So I know you must have talked about this with your listeners, which basically says there's nothing wrong with a person. It's just like the social model says disability results from a mismatch between a person and their environment. So these are people who love the social model of disability, but seem to completely fail to recognize that autism is itself a social construct, right? This is not like Down syndrome, something that is biologically determined by a certain biomarker. Autism is a syndrome and the definition has varied wildly over the course of time. Right now, the definition of autism has two core deficits. It has rigid and repetitive behavior and social communication. In other words, given the definition of autism, which is all we have, if you don't have a deficit in social communication, you are not autistic. And stop. Autism is not some kind of thing that is inherent in a person that, across space and time, that person is autistic. Autism describes a set of symptoms, and how narrow or expansively we've considered that has changed wildly over time. I describe autism in my book as perhaps the most unstable category in all of medicine. I believe that's true. So I don't understand this saying autistic people do not have a deficit in social communication. If that's the case, those people are not autistic. They may have other challenges in other arenas, or they may not. But autism right now is a diagnostic label for people who have significant deficits in both kind of rigid and repetitive behavior and social communication. So I find this whole thing rather perplexing.
Yeah, and I think it just has, so things like that annoy me, but I think they actually really negatively impact people like your son. So when I first started talking about this article, I asked, let's say you're a policymaker or you are a person who doesn't understand autism, and
Right.
you look up autism communication deficits or something, and you come across this paper. Are you more or less likely to increase funding for communication aids for people at the school that you're overseeing? For example, they don't have communication deficits.
Right.
Why would we need to provide communication aids, right? If nothing is wrong, then we need to do nothing. And especially when you're looking for things to cut, when
Yes.
you're looking for ways to do things. And also just like I think in research, like generally speaking, so I'm not sure how much you know about the double empathy problem.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm
yeah,
familiar with
yeah,
it.
but like the double empathy problem was basically like a vibes-based assessment of autism, and they straight up say in like the paper, the double empathy problem 10 years later said
Yeah.
it was mostly built off intuition and my sense from talking to other people in my peer group, and it's like, ooh.
I just
You
want to
didn't
say that
like
you've just
consider
now,
selection bias.
yeah, you've just now articulated the real material harms of the intact mind assumption, not just in research, but in policy. So the first half of my book is an intellectual history of the intact mind. And you might say, this is all like a lot of interesting philosophy and history and theory, but who cares? What is the actual impact on autistic people? But as you said, if you circulate this discourse, this neurodiversity kind of rhetoric that autism is just a difference, not a deficit, then why on earth would you spend the billions of dollars it's going to take to support autistic people, whether it's the research to unpack the causes and better interventions for people with autism or the actual services to be provided to autistic people and their families? Why would you do that if autism is not a profound deficit, if it's just a different way of seeing the world? So the fact is that this intact mind assumption really does have quite significant impact on profoundly autistic people and their families who definitely need better interventions, more support, more money going into kind of the DSP, the direct support professional care force, so that we have better caregivers to help us with our kids. There's a lot that we need. And why would policymakers fund that kind of thing if they just buy this neurodiversity rhetoric that this is all just the quirky genius
Yeah,
model?
it's all just a different variation of the same type
Or
of.
Elon
Yes.
bred autism.
And like that is still autism. It's just a
Yeah.
very different type of autism, and it's a very different presentation of autism. And like scientifically, it makes sense to group them in the same neurodevelopmental disorder. But even saying, I always catch myself because I just said it's a disorder, and like
Yeah.
people,
Right.
you're not allowed to use that. But I also think that research often gets strangled, and I say this not as someone whose research gets strangled. I'm independent. I can do whatever I want. No one's changing what I can do. I've got a computer and access to the internet. That's all I need. But a lot of the friends I know who are autism researchers will look into things like treatments or interventions, and that gets like really negatively attacked. And you wrote a paper in 2022, I believe, on the semantic toolkit. And I was wondering if you could just explain to my audience what you were trying to articulate in that.
So that paper, which I wrote with my colleagues, Jill Escher, who is also with me at the National Council on Severe Autism, and Allison Singer and Alicia Halliday from the Autism Science Foundation, we wrote that in response to truly a shocking development in the language wars around autism, which is that neurodiversity researchers published language guides in some very prominent journals, including pediatrics, that were actual charts with lists of words that researchers and clinicians were no longer allowed to use to describe their autistic subjects and patients. And these words were a lot of the words that the parents of profoundly autistic people use to describe our kids when we speak to their practitioners or even just describe them to other people, which is, no, you're not allowed to use any functioning labels. You're not allowed to use severe or profound. You can't talk about challenging behaviors. You can't talk about symptoms or risk. You can't even use the word treatment. And this kind of extreme language policing was having a very chilling effect on research, which is that researchers were having their grant proposals and their papers returned or even rejected because they were not following these guidelines. They were not using neurodiversity affirming language. And the point of that article was to say, look, language should be respectful, of course, but we need a full semantic toolbox, meaning researchers and clinicians need the full range of accurate and meaningful language to describe their autistic subjects and patients. And the idea that calling repetitive self-injury challenging behavior is not ableist and it's not offensive, it's accurate. And if we put roadblocks in the way of researchers who want to take on these extremely distressing conditions that we really do need better interventions for, we're only going to harm and further marginalize the people who these words apply to. And again, this was a case of very high functioning autistic researchers calling out language that would never be applied to them because they don't have any of these challenging behaviors, extreme self-injury or aggression or pica and so forth, but they're offended at it being used to describe others, which makes no sense.
Yeah, and I would say as an ASD1 researcher, a lot of these terms do apply to us as well. Deficit applies to us.
Yeah.
Disorder applies to us. Like
Yeah.
I study a lot of extremist online communities like incels and overrepresented of people with ASD1. And like they have a lot of genuine antisocial tendencies
Yeah.
that need to be addressed. But saying things like that gets people very upset. I just, out of curiosity, how has your book been received by academia and like by your peers and colleagues and other people like that? Has it been positive?
So I will say that I have not seen a review of my book in any kind of like an actual official review in any academic settings, but there have been several disability related academics who have reached out to me directly to compliment the book and that have started some really generative conversations about disability. The neurodiversity people have not been really coming after me anymore. They used to. So I have a blog on Psychology Today that I've had since I think my first book came out in 2014. And they used to, whenever I put out anything on there or published an article, I would get absolutely slammed. They would come and leave a ton of comments. They would complain about me on Twitter or whatever. And then I think they realized at some point that this just drove more traffic to my work. And so now they virtually never leave comments on things that I write or challenge me directly. So they might have very kind of insular conversations on
Oh yeah,
Twitter,
they do.
X. They do, but without, where if you didn't know, like they may not reference me by name or they won't reference the book or link to it. So if you were just some random person who came across this conversation, you probably have no idea who was being criticized, at least the ones that I've seen. So they're very careful. So, that's fine. They're free to criticize me amongst themselves. And of course, I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from the book directly. But again, in academia, it's hard because a lot of people who write about disability come from disability studies, which is, that's the academic arm of the disability rights movement, and they're never going to, this is where neurodiversity is living, I'm presenting. I'm trying to bring more of this message into academia, which is hopefully open some eyes about the limits of the social model, which disability studies is basically just based on the foundation of this social model. So I'm presenting at a bioethics conference, a bioethics and humanities conference in the fall about the intact mind and the telepathy tapes. I'm on a panel. They put me on a panel about autism. I'm sure that the other presenters are going to be much more neurodiversity affirming, and I could be in for some a kind of a rough time, but it's really important to make sure that these arguments about the reality of profound autism get interjected into these, especially academic conversations around disability, which couldn't be more abstract.
Yeah. I have had many of the same thoughts, but I'm glad that it hasn't been too much of a hassle because it's just a really well written book,
Thank you.
well sourced, and also quite interesting. A lot of the history of the intact mind was not really on my radar until I read it, which was very cool. But finally, I just want to wrap up this conversation by asking you two questions, really.
Yeah.
If there was something like three things that you could really hammer into my side of the conversation, or people with ASD1 or neurodiversity activists. I'm not sure how many neurodiversity activists are in my audience, but what would you say to them?
Well, I don't have anything to say to you because I
Okay, fair
feel
enough.
like you're doing exactly what I would ask as far as you're interested, you're curious, you care, about people like my sons. We're speaking together, where you're interested in working with parents and recognizing that our kids are different than you. But as far as neurodiversity activists, I would just urge them to spend some time with profoundly autistic kids or profoundly autistic adults and their families. And not and today we didn't really go so we talked about the facilitated communication thing. One of the ways in which neurodiversity activists now justify their kind of universalist approach to autism is to say, look at these spellers. And even though they were dismissed as being intellectually disabled and severely autistic, but now they're writing poetry and they're spelling that they all this neurodiversity rhetoric. So saying, obviously, the severely autistic support neurodiversity agenda. So not spellers. Go spend time with real profoundly autistic people and their families and see what and engage and see what that's like, because I think that it's hard to adopt the neurodiversity perspective once you've spent time with a profoundly autistic person and realize that there are many deficits there, and that person is never going to live the life that you're going to live. And would you trade? Never.
Yeah.
So how about a little compassion instead of self-righteous parent blaming?
Yep, I second that. Endorsed statement.
Yeah.
Yeah, so final discussion, just because I think this
Yeah.
is an interesting discussion, which is about the sort of the term autism and the diagnosis of autism. So my thought is that autism should be used as the label for the broad spectrum conditions, like how we have the term amputee. An
Yeah.
amputee could be someone who's missing a hand or all four limbs,
Yeah.
where it's just a very wide label that encapsulates a lot of different types of disability. And then specifically, we could just then delineate with ASD 1, 2, and 3. So that's what I think we should do. What do you think we should do about this sort of autism lumping that happened with the
Yeah.
DSM 5?
Well, I support the recent move to introduce the term profound autism. That term was introduced by the Lancet Commission. I think in 2021, the Lancet Commission released a big paper on the future of autism, and the commission included over 30 stakeholders, including researchers, clinicians, parents, autistic people from 6 continents. And they issued this like 60 plus page 5-year plan for autism. And just probably what got the most attention from that entire paper was a little sidebar where they recommended introducing the term profound autism to describe people who had an IQ less than 50 and minimal language, and basically who required round the clock supervision for over the lifespan. Neurodiversity activists hated this term and pushed back, but it was really rapidly taken up by virtually every other category of stakeholders. And that in general, I say I'm fighting all these common sense fights, and I can't believe we're still losing. But I will say that with the profound autism fight, we won that one. Profound autism is now used in a lot of papers. The CDC in the United States issued a prevalence report about a year or two ago on profound autism, finding that almost 27% of their recent cohort of autistic 8-year-olds met the criteria for profound autism. And just at INSAR this past spring, a consensus definition of profound autism was announced following a lengthy process, and we'll see some more scholarship on that. So I think that profound autism is here to stay. Whether there's further splitting into, the DSM has 3 severity levels, so profound autism could easily be attached to what's now known as level 3. Do we want to keep 2 others or just one? The future of that is still unknown. But I think it's really important. Functioning labels are incredibly important because we have to understand that, again, it's not just about quantitative differences, but real qualitative differences in the types of research, types of supports and services that people with autism, need depending on the severity of their presentation. So I think we're moving back in that direction, something I really support.
Yeah, absolutely. I've often said I don't really care what we do, just as long as we have categories for people like me and for
Uh,
people like your son who have very different needs. And like at a policy level, couldn't be further from each other in
Right.
many ways. And so it's not that one is like one is a bad person or anything like that. It's just
Yeah.
like
No.
the policy, we need very different things. We have very different concerns, and so there needs to be some sort of way to differentiate and target that, because within ASD1 there isn't a one size fits all solution. There are no silver bullets with ASD1, and that's even more true when you start expanding to ASD2 and ASD3. Like, the solutions that exist and the solutions that you need to implement, it's autism is a complex, one of the things I say the most is like autism is a complex heterogeneous condition that has
Yeah.
a broad spectrum of presentation, and we should just be willing to acknowledge that. And having words to describe those things is useful. Like, it is a useful, meaningful thing, and it's important that we actually do that. Any final thoughts before we part ways?
No, I would just say that I really appreciate the invitation to have this conversation. I'm really glad to know you're having lots of similar conversations, and I do think that this kind of connection across the two ends of the spectrum is really important. I honestly don't feel there's any need for all the inherent conflict between the parents of level 3 autistics and level 1 autistics. I think that there should just be mutual support in fighting our own fights, and sometimes the bigger fight will bring us together. I think we can all agree on things like we need to resolve the caregiver crisis, we need more money to go into autism supports and services, we need to build a more kind of inclusive and accommodating public arena. There's so much friction that gets in the way. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it was really good having you on the podcast. Thank you again for your time. Hey everyone, forgot to record an outro. So, thank you for listening to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. If you'd like to find me, you can find me at Christianity on Twitter. You can find me at christianityon.bluesky.social on Blue Sky, and you can email me christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. If you would like to get a copy of Amy's book, the book is called Chasing the Intact Mind by Amy Lutz. You can find it at all places that you find books. That's all for now. See you all later.